Initiation by Robert Hugh Benson. Section 18. "My word, she thinked it was all right," exclaimed Algie. It was not a very big house, but it was an exceedingly satisfactory one, having been built towards the end of the 18th century and left practically unrestored. It was the one single house on Elizabeth Street that had not been rebuilt over and over again, and it still had quite a fair garden at the back. This room, into which the two had just come, was panelled in white from ceiling to floor, large cool panels, and in the center of each hung a single good picture. It was arranged more or less as a drawing room, with a big rug by the hearth and chintz sofas round it, and a quantity of fantastic china stood on the high mantelpiece, but a vast knee-hole table was set to catch the light from the window, and beyond it opened the double doors onto the flight of steps that ran down into the garden. That formed a pleasant green background of shrubs and lawn and a bank of rhododendrons. From the center of the molded plaster of the ceiling hung an elaborate spider chandelier filled with wax candles. But it was the flowers that had made Algie exclaim. They stood on every possible table and shelf in silver bowls and slender green glass vases. They had come up from Hartley that afternoon. They were all white, and their scent filled the room. "Smells a bit like a funeral, though," said Algie, who spoke his mind undauntedly. Neville said nothing. He stood on the hearthrug with his hands in his pockets, surveying slowly from side to side. Yes, it seemed to him quite satisfactory. Then he perceived that Algie had spoken. He said. "Smells like a wedding, old chap," said Algie. The rustle of dresses was heard outside as the ladies went past to take off their wraps. Neville had received very precise instructions from Aunt Anna that the morning room, the only sitting room that faced the street, was to be provided with looking-glasses and a maid and so forth. That would leave the 3 rooms, this drawing-room, the library, and the dining-room, that all looked out onto the garden and that communicated with another by double doors, entirely free. These doors were now all set open, and Algie could see straight through to the white laid dining table with the candles burning, in spite of the evening light from the garden. "Glad you've got candles, old man," he said. "I must say, I like to see what I'm eating." Suddenly, Neville smiled at him, a perfectly simple, unconscious smile of pleasure. He was not attending to a word Algie was saying. He was thinking how perfectly delicious it was to be here, in his own house, to be able to entertain Enid like this, to have all those flowers to greet her. This, too, was to be her home some day, and therefore, when she saw it for the first time, let it be full of welcome. "Yes?" questioned Algie, puzzled at the smile. "Nothing, old man," said Neville. "I was just thinking. By the way, are you free next week? Come in and dine on Tuesday." "Right," said Algie. "And Thursday?" "Can't on Thursday. Going to a crush, and I'm dining there first." "Where?" Algie named a house. "Well, we shall meet there, then. I'm going with the Bessingtons." Then, through the opening door came Charleston, who announced names, and Enid sailed in after her mother. Start of subsection 6. By halfway through dinner, Neville was thinking that Algie must be something very like a genius. Mrs. Bessington sat on her host's right and Enid on his left. Algie faced him with his back to the windows. Neville had, too, taken Mrs. Bessington in, and she had conversed as they went through the library. Yet after the moment they had sat down, there had been no more trouble. Algie instantly played the Academy as his lead. Before, Mrs. Bessington had done more than glance at the menu, and then the stream had begun. Along that stream, like bobbing chips of wood, flowed the names of academicians, solutions of all Mr. John Collier's conundrums, reminiscences on the late Mr. Sidney Cooper's accuracy in painting the hair on the hides of cows, Mr. Lathong's sun-flecked foregrounds, and the eyes of Mr. Britton Le Riviere's collies. Then, when the stream began to run clear again, and Mrs. Bessington was still talking, of course, but talking about nothing in particular, Algie had again led off with Selva, whom they were presently to see. Obviously, he was about to say he had seen her before, but he was unable to get this out because Mrs. Bessington began to relate plots of plays in which she had seen Deuce and Sarah Bernhardt. Apparently, there was no reason why she should ever leave off doing this, because she even compared the rival merits of Italian and English scene painters in parentheses, and if one comes down to that, an infinity of subjects suggest themselves. It was enough for Miss Bessington that any kind of connection should exist in her monologues, connections of period, place, merits, association. Each thing reminded her of the next, an unfailing sequence. All this Neville heard fragmentarily as he talked in a low voice to Enid, answering her questions about the portraits that hung opposite, suggesting small plans for the future. Once he caught Algie's eye across the orchids between them, and the agonized fortitude of his friend's expression made him hastily look away again. He knew exactly what the other was feeling like. He would have laughed suddenly and loudly if he had looked a moment longer. But his friend's genius, no less than his fortitude, was a complete surprise. Miss Bessington had not said anything to her host at all since they sat down. Certainly, Algy was the man to dine with them as often as possible, but Neville thought he must relieve him when the ice came. Meantime, Enid was entirely fascinating. She was dressed in some kind of filmy blue with a single line of sapphires round her white throat. It was precisely the right tone, and finished the chord of which her clear brunette complexion supplied the rest. She had come out of the last shadow of mourning for her father at Easter. Her hair was dressed in the heavy manner that Neville loved, with blue flowers in it, and she carried another bunch at her breast. She seemed to even more vitally alive than this afternoon. Her face was steady and clear, and her eyes shone. As soon as the green bomb of ice appeared, Neville turned to the right after a look at Enid. Enid dropped her eyes demurely. "I'm simply delighted we're going to see Selva," he said. "I think—" Miss Bessington turned unseeing eyes upon him. "Well, and it was at Milan, as I was saying, Mr. Lennox, in the year 82. Neville was reprieved. With a sigh of delight, he turned again to Enid. He was not in the least annoyed. It had happened 100 times before, for Miss Bessington, when she was really under way, appeared to be simply deaf. Start of subsection 7. "Ooh, old man," said Algy as Neville came back from the door after the ladies had gone. He sank back in a seat and passed a handkerchief across his forehead. He really looked almost faint. "Have some port," said Neville, "or a cigarette? There's not time for both. I should suggest port." "But I say," began the boy, "you may break a looking-glass every time you come, if you'll do that again. You were superb." "She's a terror. I've never had so much information in my life. I feel an experienced man of the world at last. No, a cigarette. Something light." "How did you do it?" "It wasn't me. She did it all. I had 4 points ready. Academy, Selva, portraits, and the cup in the middle. I spotted that after I'd sat down, but I only got to Selva." "You better have some port, really. You've got to keep it up till 11, you know." Can't do it, old man. "And about Tuesday—" "I'm sorry," said Neville, "but you're engaged. 8:15. Algy poured himself out a glass of port after all, meditatively. Then he sipped. "Tastes like oily ink," he said. "If you'll smoke too," began Neville. "I'm drinking it to support me," said Algy. "Not pleasure, I assure you. Pleasure. If I can keep my body and soul together, it's as much—" "You were superb," said Neville again. He saw that violent flattery must be supplied. "My dear man," said Algy, "I know she's going to be your mother-in-law and all that, and I don't want to be offensive, but where does she get it all from? It's incredible. You look tired too. Suppose it was the Academy this afternoon?" "I say, yes. I haven't congratulated you yet. Well, I do now." "Thanks, old man." He did indeed feel tired. During dinner he had been elated enough, in a quiet sort of way. Even to sit by Enid seemed to him enough, but to talk uninterruptedly to her, it was almost as good as heartily. Yet now he felt suddenly blank again, as if vitality had been running from him all the time. Perhaps he had been wrong. Perhaps the very presence of Miss Bessington had been enough to drain his energy. He remembered, rather, a great doctor telling him once that some people were like that the old vampire tales really had a substratum of truth, and a more considerable substratum than most people recognized. The doctor had said also that the kind of temperament had no connection whatever, so far as he knew, with moral character. Quite nice and good people were vampirish sometimes. That was it then. Poor Miss Bessington was a vampire. The pressure on his head had returned a little, but the dinner had been a success. There was no doubt about that. Not a detail had missed fire. The room had looked perfect, the flowers had been perfect, the dinner had been perfect. He must congratulate Miss Ferguson tomorrow on her admirable management. It really was good, considering she only come up yesterday. There was the vibration of a step in the next room, and then Enid appeared, a vision of loveliness, in her swan's-down cloak and the hood over her head. "Charleston says the motor is here, Neville. We must go, for it to be in time." Ah, how charming that was! How naturally she had said it! The house really might be her own. Well, it would be in 3 or 4 months. He smiled at her, without answering.